should be able to see me
Yes!
now. Yes. Hey! How's it going?
It's good. It's so good to
Good.
see
It's
you.
good to see you.
Thank you for joining me today.
Of course. I'm happy to be here. I got really excited when we were having this conversation, so excited to do it again.
Oh,
Mhm.
I don't know if ruminating is the right word. I have been thinking about some of the things you said about we were talking about, so maybe we should introduce ourselves
We should
first.
probably introduce
Probably.
ourselves first.
So I'm Helen Dempsey-Henofer, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker in private practice in Charlottesville, Virginia. And my practice focuses on, really focuses on loss, especially holding space for non-religious folks in the loss space. And right now I'm working on writing a book on death and dying. And self-advocacy and self-compassion is super important in that venue, right, for people that are affected. So, yeah, that's me.
So I am Marquetta Sims. I am a group practice owner in Atlanta, Georgia. I primarily serve BIPOC folks, and the conversation of self-advocacy and self-compassion is so important in that population as well, because as a person that identifies with that, often find myself wanting to advocate and needing to advocate and being in all these different spaces. And sometimes that's really challenging, even when I think about just advocating for the people that I serve. So it comes up often, and that is why this conversation is really important to me.
It's a different thing, I think, that somehow it seems easier to advocate for other people
Oh, for sure.
than to advocate for oneself.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember you were saying there's this fear about that something could be taken away.
Yeah. And so, to give a little context, when we were having the conversation, we were talking about a training that I have participated in. And it wasn't even a predominantly white space. It was actually a predominantly BIPOC space. That's who the training was specifically for. The facilitators were white, and this experience of experiencing microaggressions, both covert, overt, all of the different kinds of ways that racism can show up, and what that self-advocacy looks like. So that's kind of the background for those of you that are listening that weren't kind of privy to the conversation. But that piece of going through life, I believe, in a way where I've always felt like if I speak up, if I say something, if I advocate for myself, this thing is going to be taken away from me. And I think that it really stems from this historical piece of we often have things taken away from us. So within the Black community in particular, every time we got to good places, or we got a little bit of money, or we got a little bit of nice things, it was snatched from us. And so this message that I think we receive pretty frequently of be grateful for whatever it is that you have, be grateful for what you get. The advocacy part of saying, ugh, this doesn't feel right, or something's wrong with this, that can be really difficult because we're supposed to be grateful for what we got. So when it comes to self-advocacy, I think that makes it particularly difficult depending on the space that we're in, because there's this fear that if we do advocate for ourselves, if we do say something, this might be snatched away. I even think about being in grad school and kind of feeling like if I spoke up about certain things, I might not get my degree. Like I might not be able to graduate. And it took a while to really come to terms with that and recognize that was actually a thing. This fear of losing something really contributes to the barrier, or one of the barriers of self-advocacy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting. I was having this thought as I was pulling into my parking space, getting ready to join you for this call. And I was thinking man, we would not be having this conversation if not for the systems of power and control and oppression. There wouldn't be cause for having a conversation about self-advocacy. Or maybe that is the thought that popped into my head, but I don't know how does that sit with you?
Well, I think that so much of what we experience is related to the oppressive systems that exist. Like so much of the need, so much of even the thought that I can't advocate for myself comes from that space. And so I think that we do ourselves a disservice when we don't include the system, the oppressive systems that are a part of this, because, and this is kind of where, not to shift too early into self-compassion, but I think this is where the conversation around self-compassion comes in, is because if we think of it at that larger level, that these needs or these barriers actually come from something that is outside of us, it makes it easier to navigate when you don't feel like you can advocate for yourself, right? So if we can't acknowledge that, that is when it's like, well, what's wrong with me? There is something that I'm doing wrong. I'm not good enough. I'm not brave enough. I'm not courageous enough. And it in turn, we get to internalize those different messages. But when we take it a bit larger and we're like, well, there's a whole system designed to keep us oppressed and keep us
Right.
small and keep us limited, it gives you a little more room to be able to say, okay, this isn't just about me. And if it's not just about me, if it is a larger system, then maybe there are other people who are experiencing this too. And then maybe I'm not the only person that didn't speak up. So we were talking a little bit about how in the training, I was just like, I don't have time for this. I'm dedicating a whole weekend to doing this. Can I just stay focused? And there was this part of like, more people speaking out about what was going on. It's like, oh, okay, this isn't just me, and this isn't just about this training. This is about a larger issue and a larger system that actually contributes to this. So I think that not including those systems in the conversation really does everybody a disservice.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But also acknowledging those systems, right? Like they're
Mm-hmm.
present. We are like, if you're born in the United States, we all
Yeah.
are in this immersion program, um, a
From
racist
birth.
immersion program that we're in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, it's very difficult to, like, I don't know that it's possible to really divorce yourself from that, right? Like, so
Mm-hmm.
to acknowledge that pain and give it space and kindness, because there's a choice to make, right? Like, how much energy are you going to spend, or are the people that I'm working with going to spend
Mm-hmm.
advocating for themselves versus going like, okay, my tolerance level for all the bullshit out there has been met,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm
Mm-hmm.
just going to be kind to myself in this moment. Like, that's a
Yeah,
tricky line
it
to
is.
walk. Um,
Yeah. But emotional labor is so real. Like
it
it's such
is.
a heavy thing to carry. And so I think about like the level of compassion that it has to take to be able to say, you know what? I'm not going to fight this today. Like this is not the day that I am going to fight this. There are other days and other situations and other places. And I think that there are camps around this where some people will say, actually, no, fight all the time. Like all the time
Right.
say something. Like you should
Mm-hmm.
always be pushing back. And that is just not my ministry. Like that is not something that I believe. And so I am often encouraging people, you can pull away, you can step back, you can take a break. It is okay to give yourself permission to not fight every single microaggression. And it's okay to not fight, be at every single protest and every single time. Like, I think that there's a hopefully a freedom that people can start to experience where they don't feel like they always have to be on, they always have to be fighting, because that's honestly, it's just not sustainable. And I think that in a lot of ways we feel some kind of pressure to always be doing that. And I just don't think it's necessary.
Yeah. I don't think it's sustainable at all, right?
Mm-mm,
Like, we got to be able
mm-mm,
to rest. And the
mm-mm.
expression, like, you can't pour from an empty cup is so cliche,
Yeah,
but so
so
true.
true. So true. Hmm.
and then I wonder about um, the role of the ally there, right? Like there are times where like, is there a way to leverage support in that space? So I sometimes have needed allies, right? So if I am advocating for space where people of all belief systems can just be themselves in end of life, it really helps me because I'm not going to find a whole lot of non-Christian death workers in the South. Like that's just, I don't know where that hospice is. I just don't think it's a thing.
The Bible Belt.
So I need people who don't see the world that I do, but that will join with me in holding space and honoring people who don't have the same worldview that they have, right? Like, and I'm not a person of color, but sometimes I think like I can leverage that to support folks of color. And then the question is like, where is the line? That's, you know, and I think yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I know that was a big part of what we were talking about too. It's just like when to use your voice as an ally and when to let the person that needs to be advocating for themselves use their voice. And I just really think that it comes down to choice and not furthering disempowerment by using your voice, because to me that seems counterproductive. If I'm an ally and I am making a decision around what I think would be best for you, or I am saying things that I think would be best to be said, it still takes away that power, and it takes away that person's opportunity to be able to use their voice and to advocate and speak. And so when I think about allies, and this is just me, I would prefer allies use their privilege and their power to create more spaces for me to be able to use my voice. And so instead of it like you're speaking for me, talk to the people in your communities that also need to be hearing and listening and allowing me to have the platform so that then I can move forward. Because a lot of times it's about accessing the spaces. Even when I think about like non-religious people being in religious spaces, it's about accessing that space and having it be open and inclusive and welcoming, as opposed to shunning and shaming and not welcoming. And so sometimes being on the inside of that allows you to create a more open and welcome space. And I think for me, again, that often is more important than someone speaking on my behalf, because then that takes away my ability to be able to speak. And then the other part too, which I think I mentioned to you as well, is just like sometimes I do just want like just take it.
But don't assume, right? Like,
but don't assume. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's where we can get in trouble, right? Is that when we like are exercising our voice and we're like, it's not taken care of, right? Like, and that I think is such a difficult thing for people in our field, because we do want people to be well, we do want people to be supported, and so like assuming somebody's boundaries rather than getting like curious and inquiring about their boundaries is.
And I think especially as clinicians, right? Like this is such an important conversation to have, because think about that in the work that we do. It is not always, usually not appropriate for us to just assume what our clients need or what, when we get into that space of thinking like, oh, this will be good for you, and the client has not given you their permission, you get into this sticky situation. And so honestly, I think that especially as clinicians, we are in a space of already being more attuned to that. But I think for general people overall, a lot of times, I know I have a lot of conversations with people around like someone told me what was going on, and I immediately tried to fix it. And this default into let me fix it. And it's like, well, wait. How about maybe let's just ask what that person needs at that moment. And it comes from this super authentic place, right? It comes from this really genuinely good place. And a lot of times it's doing more harm than it's doing good.
Yeah. That's such a hard thing, I think, when we're driven to help, and then in our drive to, help, we end up kind of railroading. I don't know that railroading is the right word, but just really running over somebody else's voice in that process. What was it? I was just thinking that it's the message that it's not about intention, right?
Yeah.
It's about impact.
About impact, yeah. And I struggle, I honestly struggle with that message. Like as you say, and I know that I've probably said it before, I'm sure. I struggle with it though, because I think that I don't know. I'm terrible at black and white, and so like these extremes.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm always like, is it really black and white? And so to me, like there is a space in there that I think both can exist. And I do think that like the impact is important, of course, and the intention is important. I believe in, I have a friend who will watch this and be like, do you though? I believe in grace.
Okay.
And like that's the part my friend will be
I
like,
think
really?
that's true.
I do. I will sometimes I get a little more passionate about things, and so she's like, do you? But I believe in grace. And so I do believe that we have to acknowledge, and like Growth Point Collaborative is saying, there's both. And I think if both sides can acknowledge the in between, we're in a better space, because sometimes the person who is on the offending end is only focusing on the intention, while the person that is on the receiving end is only focusing on impact. And both are valid, and meeting in the middle, I think, is where kind of where the magic happens. But that's kind of where the understanding and the conversation can happen too. So when I think about advocating, it's often in some way, shape, or form a conversation that needs to be had, a dialogue, a teachable moment. But when we are so on the extremes, it's almost impossible to actually hear the conversation, to have the dialogue, to start the change. And so I guess I want both. And whether or not it was 10% intent and 90% impact, that's fine. But I do like, I wish that we could also hear both, because I do think that both is really important.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense to me. I think like my caution, right, is that when people get stuck on the what I meant by this was, and then don't go to the place of like holding space for, okay, so that's what you meant, but here's how it landed. And we can't like, we've got to acknowledge the harm if we're going to move forward.
Agreed.
I think.
Agreed.
So I hear you on both. I think sometimes we don't get to both. And so I want people to consider impact before they dive in with intention.
Oh, for sure. Yes. And this is why I try to stay off of Facebook, because there's so much that there's so much impact that happens, and then so much intent, and the explanation is just like, we can't really do this in a Facebook comment section. So no, I agree with you. And yeah, it's hard too. Like I've realized that it's hard to move away. Like I'm even thinking about I'm a super introspective person, and so I'm even just kind of thinking about ways that I've caused harm to people. Like I know that it's happened, and how to like how hard it is to move away from that, even in the most caring and compassionate of people. It's just like, but I meant so much good. And so, yeah, it's just interesting to think about the difficulty in that too. But you're right, the impact has to be acknowledged. And Dulce said, it seems to me that sometimes intent is the beginning of something good. Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah. So we gotta figure out how to find space for both of them. We really do. Yeah.
So we covered that self-advocacy is hard.
Yep.
because
Because so many reasons.
because so many reasons, and that it makes it so that self-compassion is necessary.
Yeah.
But I wonder, though, going back to self-advocacy just for a moment, like I think having information, like when we're informed, we're better able to self-advocate. Like if we understand the systems, it helps, and we don't always have the information that we need to be able to self-advocate well.
How do you suggest getting the information?
That's a really good question. I'm trying to think. It really depends on context, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Where you're at. So I think of medical spaces, right? There's a lot of harm that happens in medical spaces, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. Sometimes people are just humans in the world and they're operating on a bunch of bias that they don't even know that they have, right? And I don't think any of us are exempt from this.
Yeah.
Just, we all have some bias. I think it's impossible to navigate the world and not do some harm because we have some bias. But if you know that going in, right, if you can say, like, here is my awareness of how this system works, then you may be able to figure out what it is that you need and leverage the parts that are there to advocate for you. So if you know that you're in the medical system, right, may or may not know that hospitals have people who are paid or volunteer advocates. Most hospital systems do. So if you feel like you are not being heard in your medical care, reaching out to those people who are volunteer squeaky wheels can be really helpful. But not everybody knows that. So if you don't know how to leverage power in the systems that exist, makes it harder. So that's where I think, like, just having the information can be helpful. And I don't always know how you have that information.
Where do you think, and again, this is still going to be kind of context specific, but it just has me wondering, where do they get that information in terms of the grief and dying process? Like,
okay.
What does that look like?
So, in the grief and dying process, there are social workers and chaplains that are in homes and are resources. There are also bereavement counselors. So I think the same thing is true, right? Like, social workers and chaplains are human beings, so they're not without bias. But they are the point person for the psychosocial existential journey in death and dying. So if you are finding that you can't have conversations with those people that are really genuine, I would ask for a different team, in the same way that you were sharing when you've experienced microaggressions. Like, sometimes that person is not the right person to hold space for you. And so that is my thinking, is that you point person needs to be someone who you can be open with. And if you don't have a good point person, you need a different point person.
And that circles us right back around to self-advocacy, right? because even having, like, I think there's so much courage in, like, so much needed courage and so much courage in advocating for yourself, because I even think about like the process of asking for someone else, right? And just even what that means. And it also just kind of takes me back to the retaliation, especially just in the medical system. And so I think I want to acknowledge too, and I think that this is kind of a part of the self-compassion as well, is that there takes so much to be able to do that. And even when I'm thinking of it in the context of like maybe a family member dying or like being in hospice or being in the hospital those last few days, just the overwhelming feeling of that. And then also having to navigate and manage biases and needing to ask for another person. So I think those are the moments where when I talk about like the intent, impact, and it being both of them, those are the moments where I'm like, but these vulnerable people, it doesn't matter what your intent is. So yeah, even that again, I still struggle with it, but I do think that I just want to honor the courage that it takes to be able to advocate. And I think that it also kind of, when we talked a little bit about that community part and of having people that either, I'm thinking particularly about like the training that kind of had similar identities, and so we were having similar experiences, but then also hopefully during this death and dying process, like maybe there are family members or there are other people that if you can't advocate, that there is another person. And so I think it all just kind of comes full circle that either having community and or allies, having courage and compassion to be able to do this work, it's just so important.
It is really important, absolutely. But I'm with you on the like in those spaces, because I think that those spaces need to be protected, right? Like if you're going through this like process of getting ready for your loved one shared existence with you on this plane of reality to end, like that time is really, really, really important. And so in those spaces, I get like pretty grouchy about about the impact not honoring the person, right? So, which I think is usually, again, it's coming from this good place. People go into those spaces wanting to care for people as they would want to be cared for, which sometimes overrides who that person is and what their needs are in that moment. So it's tricky. And so if you have I think of like, if you have someone in your family, and I probably am this person in my family who is like the kind of bulldog advocate, right? But if there's a designated person that you can go to that will like say like, okay, we're worn out, we're emotionally depleted, but this needs to be said. There might be someone who is in that space that can leverage that, and there may not be. So if there's not, it's important to know like, okay, this is the reality that we're in. How can I take care of this system?
Yes. And I think that is the most important part, is how can I take care of this system, as opposed to I have to do all of these things. And even if some of the things don't feel right, so even if the team, you're feeling like they're not caring for your needs in the way that you need to, or you're feeling like this training isn't supportive as you need it to be, right? Like, what for your system, what for yourself is going to be most impactful and most helpful? And can you give yourself that without beating yourself up about needing to have it?
I am curious what you got in your toolkit, because I think like for some reason I've got an association between Dr. Marquetta Sims, right, and like some really great compassion,
Yeah.
self-compassion, self-resourcing. Like, this is where she
Yeah.
shines. I'm gonna learn
Oh. Put me on the spot. Oh, let's see. This is probably gonna sound really corny, but there it is. I'm a yoga and meditation teacher, and so I spend a lot of time not just practicing yoga, but also like practicing the principles of it. And so there are ethical principles associated with yoga, and trying as much as possible to embody those is so important to me. So one of them that I'm thinking about in particular is being honest and telling the truth. And that's a really big part. And so whether that's telling the truth to other people or telling the truth to myself and being honest with myself, that's a practice that I think is really important. But also the practice of like restorative yoga of just slowing down and being still, that just helps me to really kind of reconnect with myself and turn inward, because a lot of the barriers to being compassionate with yourself often are external. They often come from these external stimuli that activate these internal beliefs. And so the more that you can tune out all of those and just really get back to a space of like, I'm good. Like, I'm okay. In this moment right here, I'm great. So that's really helpful. And then also like mantras. And I don't know, mantras. Ugh. I have a thing about words. So like mantras and affirmations, I don't really like those words, but
Uh-huh.
those are familiar to people. But there are things that I say to myself over and over again, that really help me. And then because I am a Christian, like that's a really big part of my identity. Gospel music always grounds me and brings me back down and reminds me of like what my value is, what my worth is, why I matter. Um, Journaling. I don't know. They all feel so cliche because it's
You've
like,
got like you got a backpack of tools,
I
is
know
what
I
it
have a
sounds
whole
like.
backpack of tools because I need a lot of it. There's always something going on. And I'm like, no, we got to stay grounded. Um, so yeah, I think those are, I just, some of them I feel like it's so like therapist-y of me like, oh, go journal.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, and I like, I am a non-religious person, and
Hmm.
I really enjoy connecting with you because we see the world in different ways, but we also need to support people with very similar
Yeah.
issues. Um, and so even though I do this thing, right? When you say affirmation, and I'm like, oh, that sounds really wooey, Marquetta.
Yeah.
um,
You know I'm all about the woo, Helen.
I know you are, and I love that for you. But but the reality is like the if we think about um, the way in which our brains work, right, and that those connections that fire together wire together. And
Mhm.
so I don't think we get to like push an off button and those negative thoughts just go away. I don't believe that that happens, but I do think that in being compassionate to ourselves, I really like the exercise of like imagining your future self and what if
Mhm.
you are talking to your future self
Yeah.
from a place of like open compassion and support, and they are seeing you, they have walked this road before, they've been on this journey. How is that person holding space for you? Like
Mhm.
that,
Mhm.
you know, might be a little bit wooey, but I don't
A
use
little
that
woo.
word.
It's a little woo, Helen. It's fine. It's okay.
um,
Mhm.
but I think that helps me to help people build internal resources. And then going back to what you were saying about like, okay, in this moment, what are we paying attention to right now? And that has been such a beautiful part of death and dying work for me, is like, okay, so this is true. Like, we are on a time limited offer. Um,
Mhm.
but you can be right here in this moment holding this person's hand while the sunlight filters through your window and you're like smelling the tea on the stove and you're enjoying Tuesday afternoon, right? Like this moment is what you got. So that I've just like these little points in time that are enormously powerful. So, love it. Love getting to do that work. So, very, very.
It's hard work.
It is hard
so hard
work.
But
it is. I mean,
much
we don't.
Needed.
In the realms of like supporting people in mental health work, we get to support people in growth and in like going through the journeys that life throws at us. And they're not easy.
Recognizing, not at all. And recognizing that like death is a part of that. And I know that even in the work that we've been doing, that grief is a part of that, and that loss is a part of that, and the sooner that we accept that loss, because it's not always just death, it's not always of someone dying, but the loss of someone terminating or having to end therapy, or a loss of a job, loss of freedom. Like we've had so much loss over the last year for sure, but the accepting that is a part of life. Like there's this saying, I guess, that nothing lasts forever, and it's true. Like things on this earth do not last forever. Relationships do not last forever. And so I think that we spend a lot of time avoiding that, but accepting that is a reality, and accepting mortality, and accepting ends and life being finite, I think is such an important part of just coping and existing as well. Like accepting the finite nature of things allows you to live differently, to me anyway.
I mean, I think that's like, I don't know, it's having a structure, right? Like we have a beginning and an end, and there's space in between. That makes meaning making so important. Like this, we have this time. How are we going to use it? And that can be really hard, like when we're in a hard place, or when we are struggling with self-advocacy, or when we're struggling with anxiety and depression, and we're feeling frozen. So I think sometimes when we start talking about values and meaning making, it can bring up a lot of shame. I feel like that's a whole other conversation.
I was gonna say, Helen. Woo! We might have to schedule another IG Live for that one, because we can go down the rabbit hole with shame for sure. Oh my goodness.
I really appreciate you going down the rabbit hole with me a little bit today and talking about self-compassion and self-advocacy.
Absolutely. This was so good.
I just want to say that I am grateful for you, and I want for everyone to like have friends and connections that you can have real frank conversations with.
I agree, and I'm grateful for you as well, Helen. And we just did this on like a super public platform, so I'm gonna then go and like get into child's pose, because this is a lot.
It is a lot.
But
at some point we're gonna have like a conversation about nothing, Marquetta, and it's gonna be great.
Sure, Helen. I look forward to that day.
All right.
Oh, yes.
Bye.
Bye, Helen.